translation and transformation. Transformation is implying a change, as you know, from a certain position to another. And here it is implying and claiming a change in Islamic publishing houses in Turkey. Regarding translation, this lecture is based on a certain conception of translation, foregrounded by contemporary translation studies, seeing translation as a socially embedded phenomenon. However, before starting, I would like to learn what you think of translation. If you would like to share your opinion about translation, or what do you expect from translators when reading a book translated from a foreign language? Anybody who wants to make a contribution? But we can also talk about this later, of course. Just keep this question in mind. Today the discussion will be based on a case study from Turkey, focusing on one major publishing house. The first part of the lecture will try to provide some background information. Hereby I will briefly introducing translation of the issue of translation of Western classics into Turkish during the Ottoman Empire and in Republican Turkey, also the issue of Turkish language reforms, and a glimpse of information about contemporary Turkish politics. The second part will focus on translation, as I said, as a socially embedded phenomenon, looking on translation and publishing houses, the strategies of publishing houses. And in the third part, I hope that we will have energy and time for discussion. Let us first look at a newspaper debate in summer 2006, which triggered the questions also for the case study presented today. The banner headline of a daily newspaper, which is called Radical, having almost the same meaning in English, read like this: Blessed Morning Hans, books on the reading list, 100 essential reads, recommended to school children, have been translated according to the ideology of each publishing house. This was in 2006. The article claimed that some publishers were distorting Western classics according to their own ideology. Although this ideology was not specifically labeled, the readership in Turkey could easily guess what kind of ideology it was, or what kind of ideology it was meant. It was Islamism. For several weeks after this first headline, the issue remained on the agenda of Turkish media. Many politicians were on TV channels, and scholars from various translation and interpreting departments published their articles again in the newspapers, some of them in the Sunday supplement of Radical called Radical 2. These were the claims made public in the newspapers. The rigorous and continued criticism in the newspapers forced government authorities to appear on various TV channels, as I told. Many books were withdrawn from the market, as it was again reported in Radical. Several of the Islamic publishing houses concerned spoke out to deny any ideological bias. Translators remarked in their own defense that their choices of some certain lexical items were prompted by colloquial usage in the Turkish culture, and that they were not ideologically motivated. By the end of 2006, the public interest in the topic faded, and many critics seem to have been appeased by the fact that many books were withdrawn from the market. At first sight, the debate in 2006 seemed to reaffirm on a wider scale the process of deliberate tailoring to the expectations of an Islamic readership that academics in translation studies had hinted at in their works. However, I think this issue needs to be discussed beyond hasty assumptions. First, some brief remarks about the political situation in contemporary Turkey. As you may know, Turkey is ruled since 2002 by the party, or Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi in Turkish, that can be translated into English as the Justice and Development Party, in short AKP. Although this party labels itself as a conservative party, the foregrounded Islamic identity of many of its leaders, their former political affiliations, is a reason for the perception within and outside Turkey that AKP is an Islamic party. The debate of 2006 in the Daily Radical needs to be contextualized within that political environment. The accusations, as well as the statements by politicians and the arguments in defense put forward by the accused publishing houses, reflected in a perfect way the rupture of the Turkish society at that time between the supporters of the government and the opponents. Although generalizations are not healthy, and I'm not a political scientist to make out statements, the opponents can be considered those grouping in the Turkish society which belong on the one side to the establishment of the Kemalist regime, on the other hand those parts of the society that distrust AKP's political aims and fear an Islamizing of the country. In fact, as I told, scholars in the field of translation studies had already shown an interest in the Islamizing tendency of the Turkish translations of Western classics over the previous 2 decades. Until the media event of 2006, however, the Islamic publishing house's growing interest in Western classics did not catch the eye of the public. In fact, translation of Western classics into Turkish have always been subject to heated discussions, whether during the Ottoman Empire or in Turkey. I would like to briefly say a few words on the history of translation of Western classics into Turkish until the Tanzimat, or the reorganization period in the Ottoman Empire, starting with the proclamation of various reforms in 1839. The interests in the Ottoman Empire in Western European publications was restricted to the scientific, military, or philosophical fields. However, as from the Tanzimat period, European literature started to be translated into Ottoman Turkish, and with the introduction of new literary genres through translation, the first debate on the translation of Western classics into Turkish also arose during that period. Participants were divided into which works should be translated into Turkish, which were worthy of it, and how these translations should be made. However, there was one point all agreed, that the translation of canonical works of European literature should be to support the modernization of the empire according to the models current in the West. Thus, the idea of translating literary works into Turkish from European languages was closely linked with the idea of progress. Thereafter, during the Republican period, following the establishment of Turkey as a republic, the translation of Western classics were on the agenda of the state-sponsored Translation Bureau. Translations were instrumentalized by the ruling elite pursuing the transformation of the society. It can be said that translation came to be, and I quote, regarded as an instrument of enlightenment and modernization of the late Ottoman and early Republican periods by the ruling elites and the intellectuals of the country. We can further say that translation was vigorously implemented as a means of enlightenment and modernization. in extensive social and cultural transformation projects during the first decades of the Turkish Republic. That's why there was also a negative stance towards or against these translations in Islamic circles from the beginning on. In the debate of 2006, the evidence for the ideological distortions, in fact Islamizing, claimed by many journalists, was found in particular choices of lexical items and expressions. On the other hand, the accused publishing houses and their translators defended their lexical choices or preferences on grounds of culture. In order to understand this issue, we should also look at the language reforms in the early Republican period in Turkey, because the Turkish language was for many, many years a battlefield. As you may know, during the Ottoman Empire, the Arabic script was used. Following the establishment of Turkey, the alphabet was reformed in 1928. The former Arabic script was replaced by Latin, or with Latin letters, and a profound language reform followed. It should be noted, however, that the reform of the alphabet and the purification of the language was already an issue during the Ottoman Empire, because there was a break, or we can say a gap, between the well-educated elite, which used the Ottoman language that was made up of Turkish, Persian and Arabic words, with the syntactic element of all three languages in a weird composition, between the elite, as I said, the gap between the elite and the broader public. The Turkish part of the broader public spoke plain Turkish, as we call it. That's why there were already heated debates to find a way to ease communication between the ruling elite and the broader public, the Turkish public. The Ottoman Empire was, as you know, a multilingual empire. The reform of the alphabet, together with efforts to purify the language from words of Persia-Arabic origin, aimed to create a new Turkish language, which should be the basis of a Turkish identity in the new nation state. And this triggered, of course, resistance in certain groupings of the society, because the language reforms meant also an extensive break with the Islamic past, so that we may even say that even today, all these resulted that we now have three discourses in the Turkish language, meaning pure Turkish on the one hand, propagated by the language reforms, then a reactionary Turkish immersed with Persian, Arabic or Ottoman words, and then as from the 80s we see a more liberal stance, combining well-established and commonly accepted words of Turkish origin, but also of words from the Ottoman language, in addition loanwords. So when we translate, even today in Turkey, the translator can find him or herself in the position of choosing among these three discourse options. And any discussion on an ideological involvement is already, from the critic's position, in one of these three discourses. And maybe this brings us also at the borderline between translation and ideology, because the readiness to trace ideology in others is greater, as Terry Eagleton says, than the willingness to accept its existence in one's own behavior. And translation is a perfect example where you can see this reflected. Now let's have a closer debate at. Let's have a closer look at the debate. The Ministry of Education of the AKP government issued lists of 100 essential reads for primary and secondary schools in 2005. These lists had been subject to lively debate from the beginning on because people were discussing how to define canonical works, which titles to choose, etc. So when the debate in 2006 was on the agenda of media in Turkey, the public was already aware with this issue of these infamous lists by the ministry. This time it was how the translations of these Western classics were or had been made. So the motivation of some Islamic publishers in Turkey to include translations of Western classics in their publication lists can certainly be explained by the appearance of these reading lists. Following the publication of the lists in 2005, many publishers, not only Islamic, which had not previously published Western classics, immediately began to do so. Because we have 15 million children and youngsters in primary and secondary schools in Turkey, so the sales of these works promised to be healthy, even guaranteed. A ministry-approved logo was put on the books, on the list, which was understood by the public or broader public to assure quality and reliability. It seems that the accused publishing houses, two of them were, I would like to name here, of the Islamic publishing houses. One was Damla and the other was Nihir. We can say that they too, they also took these reading lists as an incentive. But if we look closer on these publishers, which are still publishing or covering children's books, classics, history books, and books on Islamic studies, we can see that they had already started to publish the translations of Western classics before, in the 1990s, to be precise, or 1995, one of them. But there is a steep increase beginning at 2005, the date when the ministry published these lists. If we look at the publishing market in Turkey, the late 1980s and 1990s witnessed the appearance of Islamic publishing houses at the center of the market. A situation consolidated in the 1990s as confirmed by scholars like Gülalp and Tosun Arı and Taş. And it was also in the 1990s that these publishing houses began to show an interest in the translation of Western classics. In fact, we may say that this interest seems to contradict with their previous stances. Even without extensive textual study, which was not, of course, mentioned in the dailies, it will be legitimate, I think, to assume that Islamic domestication may exist in various degrees in the translations of the works commissioned by Islamic publishing houses, which openly declare their policy to publish work in line with Islam. However, Islamic publishers, like neither the others, cannot be classified in one rigid category, nor can it be assumed that all Islamic publishing houses follow the same strategy in their translations. And it is these distinctions I will turn now. Although the interest in Western classics varied over time and was chiefly associated with secularized publishers, the Ministry of Education lists indicate that these works seem to have achieved an exalted status in the Turkish society, so that children and youngsters are encouraged and expected to read them. The interest of Damla and Nehir publishers in retranslating these listed classics predominantly for an Islamic readership can thus be partly explained by the prospect of lucrative sales. On the other hand, it seems logical that they had to meet the expectations of their usual target readership, and in that part remain consistent with their previous publication policies. However, the prospect of sales is not, I think, a sufficient explanation for this phenomenon. It will be a small repetition, but still, it is important to note that these publishing houses had already discovered the classics earlier and made use of the symbolic capital of these works in their efforts to move from the periphery to the center of the publishing field in Turkey. Let's have a few words on the previous translations of these Western classics by the Secularist League. It should be noted that Christian religious elements, which are existing in Western classics and also in children's classic, in the source text, had been simply silenced, as shown by scholars in translation studies. Now, these textual elements seem to have been foregrounded and transformed into an Islamic discourse or context. That's why the accused publishing houses and their translators could fairly claim that they did not make any additions to the source texts. And that's how we can come to the borderline between acceptable and non-acceptable translation. Preference for flattening or emphasizing religious elements are decisions resulting from a particular positioning or ideological stance, and the media discussion revealed that the discussion between acceptable and non-acceptable choices in translation or in translating too is shaped by the critic's own positioning or ideological stance. In the debate, the intervention in translations made previously the flattening out of religious elements by pro-secularist publishers were considered to be acceptable. On the other hand, because they said in a non-Christian target culture, it was acceptable that works produced in a Christian culture were tailored. However, with regard to the Islamic domestication, the decision to foreground religious elements were criticized. The Islamic publishers applied this same distinction, denying any ideological involvement and explaining their choices as a factor of Turkish culture. Thus, decisions which seem to be acceptable according to one's own positioning are justified as culture or in cultural terms, while those rejected are associated with a particular negatively connotated ideology. This we could see in the debate in 2006. Underlying this aspect, I would like to go to another issue that was brought to my attention with this debate. If we concede that the decision by some Islamic houses to publish Western classics may have been partly motivated by the wish to exploit the religious elements or connotation of these classics, another line of explanation seems also possible. The usual readership of Islamic publishers started to buy Western classics, a move probably encouraged by the ministry's initiative, the exalted status of these Western classics in Turkey. The securely established status seemed to have reassured people in Islamic circles as well. In fact, it was this status which seemed to be promising the possibility of gaining cultural capital in Bourdieu's sense, providing people with traditional Muslim roots or Muslim conservative roots with the opportunity to attain new positions in the Turkish society. It is, on the other hand, I mean, this is with regard to the readership, but it will, if we look from the perspective of the publishers, we can say that these Western classics were also an opportunity for the publishers to reach new readers, to reach new segments of readership outside of their classical Islamic readers in Turkey. When the media debate attacked Islamic publishers, I noticed that journalists did not once mention Timaş Yayınları. This is today one of the biggest publishing houses in Turkey, starting as a small publisher in 1982. Today, Timaş is a big publication group with several publishing companies and owning its own distribution company, etc. How did this publisher, which is the first Islamic publishing house to publish translation of Western classics in Turkish, avoid becoming embroiled in the dispute? I think that's an important question, and its answers may bring important insights into contemporary Turkey. The journalist Emre Boztepe from Radikal, in his article on August 25, he drew on the example of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Boztepe did not mention once the translation published by Timaş Yayınları. In fact, I can show you the list of the translations from Robinson Crusoe into Ottoman Turkish and modern Turkish. Here we have first the list into Ottoman Turkish of Robinson Crusoe. And then comes a long list with many, the names of the translators do change also until today. So it's a huge list. We love Robinson also in Turkey. And now when we come to... Here, this is the first... Oh, I can use this one. By Timaş. One translation. Then we have one in 2004. And then we have this one. So the publishing house has 3 versions of Robinson Crusoe. The reason why I was startled of not seeing Timaş is that its first translation of 2001 can be said to use an overtly Islamic discourse. Here are the 3. Banu Karada observed in an extensive comparison of the 2001 translation and the source text that in the target text there are certain parts highlighted in bold and presented in quotation marks which do not exist in the source text. In addition, extensive footnotes are made available which do not only explain lexical choices, which we often meet in translations. When you read translations, we often come across footnotes where the translator or the editor try to explain some lexical choices in the target language, or where they give some background information which is considered necessary to understand the translation. But here, Karadağ claims that an extensive discourse is also added into the text with the footnotes, but also into the main text itself. Here I have one example. These bold fonts do not exist, and these quotation mark, this phrase, hell for the crew, is not existing in the source text either. It is an addition. There are many examples of it. I have just one. So Karadağ tried to locate where this addition comes from, and she has seen that this statement or expression, hell for the crew, was taken from the second volume of the Turkish Muslim thinker Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, from his collected works. In fact, Timaş Yayınları has one main series which is called Bediüzzaman Kitaplığı, Bediüzzaman Library, in which more than 20 books about Said Nursi have been published. In addition, one of the founders of Timaş Publishing House, known as Hekimoğlu İsmail, has written 3 books on Said Nursi. And here I just wanted to show you another example. Here you have the target text, and here you have the source text. We also see that, the discourse is being changed a little bit, let's say. There is a real difference between the target text and the source text. In contemporary translation studies, or I myself, I'm a translator, there is always a difference between the source text and the target text. But, this can be considered as going beyond an acceptable interpretation or the restraints of the target language. But, as I said, we knew in academic circles the existence of this translation. But the publishing house's name did not appear, and in fact this was not maybe a surprise. It was a surprise, but then when you look closer, it is you can understand the reason, because the second translation, published in 2004, is already a source-oriented translation without all these additions and omissions. And then comes after the debate, the 2007 translation, and there we really have no Islamizing discourse in the translation. So the publishing house has radically, let's say, changed its own translation strategy. It should be also said that you cannot find the 2001 edition in the market anymore, and also not the 2004 translation. Maybe you could find it in some second-hand books, but normally it's very difficult to have a copy. For the moment, you can only find, or Timaş is only selling its latest 2007 edition, or the translation. I have compared the 2007 translation with the 2001 translation by Ali Çankırılı, and I took as a criteria the ones Banu Karadağ did. In addition, I looked how the word God was translated into Turkish. In the first translation, God was translated as Allah. That is perfectly normal. But in the latest one, you only find the Turkish equivalent Tanrı. So the word Allah, the Arabic word Allah, which is in Turkey commonly used, interchangeably used, Allah and Tanrı, which was Allah was preferred in the first one, but not in the latest one. I had a talk also with the editor of Timaş Publishing Houses, and she said, well, we are not using Allah anymore because then we get criticism and get a bad image on the publishing house with regard to the translations of Western classics in Turkey. The expansion of Timaş Yayınları into a publishing group with a distribution company and several affiliated imprints, each dedicated to a specific genre or series, has led to an expansion of its readership as well. And in this context, we can explain the changes in the translations from Western sources. In order to expand from a small publisher to a publication group, Timaş Yayınları had to reproduce its economic capital and transform that capital in such a way to reach new readerships, and once addressing a narrow Muslim readership and positioning itself in the tradition of Islamic publishers in Turkey, Timaş Yayınları is now addressing differentiated groups of readers. The editor told me that now their target was urban readers in Turkey. This also explains why Timaş publishes translations made by the renowned translator and poet Behçet Necatigil. Necatigil is mostly known, in fact, as a poet in Turkey. He has also published some lexica on Turkish literature. He has also worked as a teacher of literature in one of the oldest secular high schools in Istanbul, of which he is also a graduate. So Necatigil himself is a symbolic name in the Turkish, in literature, but also in the publishing sector, because he has 35 translations from German into Turkish. He translated inter alia works by Rainer Maria Rilke, Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, Heinrich Heine, but also Knut Hamsun, August Strindberg, from German again. Timaş is publishing Necatigil's translation of Knut Hamsun, and on the cover it is specifically indicated that they are using the translation by Necatigil, and that they also have included a foreword by Necatigil. Thus, the publication of the translations made by Necatigil is necessarily contributing to the new image of the publishing house, or we can claim this. In fact, a parallel movement can be detected among Islamic groupings that previously took an active stance against Turkey's official policy of modernization. Their shift from the periphery to the center of the political system in Turkey, and the transformation of some of them from radical Islamist reactionary groupings or positions into a conservative right-wing party forming the current government, reflects changes in Turkish society that may also explain explain the interest of the readers in these circles in Western classics. The new bourgeoisie that is forming among small and middle-scale or medium-sized enterprises with a religious conservative background is currently foregrounding its Islamic identity. However, this identity does not reject neoliberal politics, nor does it exclude the technological and communicational advancements of modern life, or its habits of consumption. Like all members of the middle and upper classes, they want to send their children to schools with mainly European languages as the medium of teaching, followed by universities studied abroad, especially in Europe or the USA, as claimed by Demir in 2005. Thus, the economic capital, these families seem to try to expand the social and cultural capital of their offsprings. Now, I will close. In the Turkish context, it is common to use the metaphor of the mirror to describe translation. The mirror as an image, between, or as a symbol between the relationship, source text and target text. For the present case, however, instead of the usual application of this metaphor to depict the relation between the target and the source text, we might wish to apply it to show how translation is a socially embedded phenomenon. As Lawrence Venuti, a translation scholar, puts it, the choice of the foreign text, the development of a discursive strategy to translate it, and the reception of the translation are each inscribed with codes and ideologies that support political agendas in the domestic culture. By extending their usual publishing portfolio to other subjects, Islamic groupings in Turkey have expanded into areas not on their agenda some decades ago. Translation here is not only reflecting social changes and transformation, it may also serve as a tool to implement that transformation, helping to expand the cultural hegemony of particular positions. And these were my last words. Thank you for your patience. Pure Turkish, with the language reforms, we had the purification of the language, and we had, the Ministry of Education has given some universities or some academics the task to produce pure Turkish equivalents for those Ottoman words.
And those Ottoman words that were not pure Turkish,
yes,
Persian,
etc. And these pure, it was, today it doesn't make sense, but it was, I know, for example, I can give you an example of Turkish academics in philosophy from Istanbul University who was criticized officially from the Ministry of Education, Macit Gökberk. He's one of Turkey's, the second generation of Turkish academics in philosophy, who was criticized or warned officially for not using the pure Turkish equivalents of philosophical terms.
Because those would be more Europeanized.
No, not more Europeanized, but from the roots of the Turkish language, some equivalents were offered, or they were voted, this to use, and he was criticized for not using these ones, and still for sticking to philosophical terms of the Ottoman language. The origins of the Turkish language from the of the Turkish, I mean, Tukutatku Bilik, etc. Okay, so there were new dictionaries looking back to the roots of the Turkish etymological roots, and trying from there to make up new words with allegedly pure Turkish roots. So a fabricated language. And you can, I mean, today the lines between these positions are blurred, and that's a good thing, I think. But I mean, 20 years ago, you could really find people in the, I mean, for example, translators in the position to choose which were forced to choose from these purely Turkish terms. And by their usage of language, you could categorize also people, like we are used in Turkey to categorize people in the way they clothe, etc. And that's why I used the term battlefield. I think that's very difficult to understand when you did not have something like this in your language. Yeah. And as I said, this language was meant to serve as the basis for the new national identity in the nation state. I think, with regard to this publishing house, Timaş Yayınları, the move from the periphery to the center of the publishing field, being a small publishing house formerly, with the aim to expand in the publication field, I think they have noticed that exploiting Western works of literature were a hindrance in this aim. I mean, they have other means or other series of other works in their portfolio to reach or to apply an Islamic discourse or to reach Muslim readers. But with works of Western literature, I think they wanted to stick to the image of source-oriented translations, because an Islamic domestication of these works caused for them or impaired the reliability of the publishing house. Because if you want to buy Western work of literature, then you expect also to read a work that in a way represents or that may be representing Western culture. Okay, so the new readers, I mean, these publishing houses, I mean, Timaş is of course one of the biggest now today in Turkey, but it used to be a small publishing house selling books mainly for an Islamic readership. Thus, books on Islamic studies, etc. With these new readers, I mean, they can also reach readers outside these Islamic circles. It is, of course, very difficult to label people like Islamic and Muslim. I mean, we are speaking of a country where officially 99%, labels him or herself as a Muslim. But she said, the editor in the interview said that now they are targeting urban readers. Urban readers, people living in the cities, who also, in a way, become westernized in a globalized world, I think. That's also maybe the segments of the society they want to reach. Not only higher class, but readers which formerly did not buy books produced by Timaş. Also children, yes, and their parents, yes. We did not, used to have big bookstores in Turkey, for example. We used to have small bookstores. And now, for example, Timaş Publishing House has also a big bookstore. And the publishing house is on top of the bookstore. And in this bookstore, there is also a corner for kids' books. I mean, this we did not have that, I think, 10 years ago. The last decades, of course, many things have changed. But in that bookstore, you have this nice little corner. And they also sell coffee, not only tea. Like you can also buy their cafe latte, etc. So it's, all these small things contribute to a new image. And these are, I think, this is also a sign showing that they're really targeting urban readers. And you can, by selling them Western classics to the families, they can also sell them their own children books by their own authors, which may use, I haven't compared it, which may use a more Islamic discourse.